Hi, I'm Christina, and this is a book review of The Drift by C.J. Tudor. So this was published in 2023 and it's my third novel by this author. I have also read The Chalk Man and The Burning Girls. Now I really enjoyed both of those books, so I was highly anticipating this one, but unfortunately it was a little bit of a disappointing read for me, and overall I found it quite underwhelming. So this one is a science fiction, post-apocalyptic, thriller, horror genre. It really has a lot of genres in this one, and she's very good at doing the thriller / horror genre, and this one kind of brings the science fiction, dystopian, post-apocalyptic element in it too, and that is a genre that I absolutely love. I have read so many post-apocalyptic novels, and this one unfortunately just didn't really hit the mark in terms of that genre for me. So I think the world building in terms of the kind of virus and the post-apocalyptic was just a little bit underwhelming. It kind of left something to be imagined. I don't think the world building was particularly strong, and that was a real shame for me. So that was one of the things that I didn't like so much in this. But let me just tell you a little about what the story is about before I go into what I didn't like about it. So the story is told through 3 different perspectives, and the first perspective we hear from is called Hannah, and she is a medical student at this elite academy, this boarding school in the mountains. Now there has been an outbreak of the virus in the boarding school, and they're trying to evacuate the students who have tested negative for the virus, and she is currently on a coach. She is evacuating the academy, and the aim is to get to the place called the retreat, and they hope that's going to be like some kind of safe haven. So she's on a coach, and then the coach crashes in the midst of this snowstorm. And then the second perspective is a woman called Meg, and this is also during a snowstorm, and she is in a cable car trying to also get to the retreat. And then the cable car stops in the middle of the air and all of these people are trapped. And then the third perspective is a man called Carter, and he is actually at the retreat, the place where Meg and all of her people and Hannah and all of her people are trying to get to. And then you see these chapters between the 3 people just alternating. And I think the characters, again, leave something to kind of want for. So the characters were a little bit one-dimensional, and I don't think they were kind of fully developed, and I don't think the potential of the characters was fully realised. So the story itself has 3 separate locked room mysteries. You have the people trapped in the coach with Hannah, the people trapped on the cable car with Meg, and the people trapped at the retreat with Carter. And I do like that aspect of it. I liked that we were seeing from 3 different perspectives, and there was one very clever plot device related to the perspectives that I really enjoyed, and I definitely didn't see coming. It really did surprise me, and when it kind of clicked into place I was like, oh, that is clever, because there was an assumption I made that wasn't true, which affected everything, and I thought that's a really clever plot device, and I really enjoyed it. And I think for me personally, that was the absolute best part of this book. Another good thing about the book is the fact that it was so fast-paced. I read this in just a few days. It was just so easy to keep turning those pages. I was kind of compelled by the story in the sense that I wanted to know what was going to happen. But just overall, it left me feeling a little bit disappointed and a little bit underwhelmed, partly because the characters felt a little bit one-dimensional, and there was a lot of action in this. There was so much action, and I felt like that came at the expense of kind of really developing the characters. And there was a lot of gore in this. I don't really mind gore, but it doesn't really do anything for me either. And as a kind of horror kind of book, I didn't find it scary at all. There were definitely scenes that were just unpleasant and just horrible, actually. Some of them were quite gory, but it didn't scare me. It didn't kind of unnerve me or unsettle me. And I do think in her previous books, with The Chalk Man, that was such a creepy kind of novel. It was definitely a little bit disturbing, and it made me feel on edge. And then with the Burning Girls, that was definitely kind of eerie, and it had kind of paranormal aspects, and it definitely made me feel unsettled. And this one just didn't. I didn't feel any of those kind of feelings. I wanted to know what was happening, but I didn't feel unsettled or disturbed or any of those kind of things. And I think that was a shame. So in comparison with her other two books, I think they were much, much stronger books in the sense that the characters were so much better and the plot was just so much better in so many different ways. And this one was just a bit of a shame. Like, honestly, it felt like a different person had written this one compared to the other two books that I really enjoyed. So now to really tell you a little bit about the rest of the book, I'm gonna have to go into some spoiler territory. So if you still want to read the book and you don't want me to spoil anything, please do stop the video now, go away and read the book, and then come back once you've read it and we can talk about spoilers. Okay, so we're into spoiler territory now. So I'm just going to tell you some of the things I didn't like about this book. So for me, this book was meant to be a survival story. The whole point of the book is to see who is going to survive. You have an incredibly large cast of characters at the start of the book, and the death count is incredibly high. Basically everyone dies in this book at some point, and the deaths just come really quick and really fast, so much so that you don't really feel connected to a lot of the people who do die, because they're just kind of secondary, tertiary characters that you barely even know who they are. You kind of have a name and maybe a vague description of what they look like. So when they do die, it doesn't really hit you hard at all. I would say that's one of the disappointing things, is that it isn't hard hitting when a lot of these characters die, because so many of them are just peripheral characters that don't really mean anything to you, don't really mean anything to the story, don't really mean anything to the plot, and they're just kind of there to bump up the death count, in my opinion. So that was a little bit of a shame, to be honest. And also, the fact is, I thought this is a survival story. That's kind of the whole point of this book. But basically, at the end, everyone dies. All the main characters, dead. Hannah, Meg, Carter, they're all dead. Basically, everybody is dead. And I just thought, well, what was the point? Like, what was the point in the whole story if basically everyone dies? Is that the message? Is the message that it was just pointless? Everything everybody strived to do to protect themselves and to save the people they loved and to avenge the deaths of the people they loved, it just came to nothing and everything was meaningless. I didn't like that kind of ending, in the sense of, oh, what a shame. So one person is still alive, and she is Eva. And just to give you the little backstory, this gets a little bit complicated as well. So she's the only person alive at the end, and she is the baby who was born on the coach. So just to go back a little bit, on the coach, you had your main character of Hannah, and she is a medical student, and when the coach crashed, lots of people died because of their injuries on the coach, so kind of they were dead on impact. And then one of the girls had really bad injuries, but she was still alive, barely. Turns out a little bit later on that she was actually pregnant. She is pregnant, and she goes into labour, and then Hannah does kind of a cesarean on her, takes the baby out, and the girl dies. And that baby is then called Eva. And the brother of the girl who dies, so the uncle of the baby, is called Daniel in this one, in this kind of perspective. And he saves the baby. Basically, everyone else dies in this perspective, including Hannah. And Hannah was my favourite character in the book. I thought she was the most interesting character. I thought she was the most nuanced, definitely most interested in her story. She just dies, gets killed by her dad, who was the leading virologist in the world, and that was that. So the only people left from that perspective is Daniel and the baby Eva. So that is his niece. It was his dead sister's baby. So at the end, the only person who lives is Eva. She is the baby. We don't follow her. When she is the baby, she is taken away by Hannah's dad, the leading virologist, and we never hear from her again. And at the very end, she's about 16 years old, and she's okay. She's the only person who lives. And also, it seems as though she is going to be the cure to the virus. And it just seemed a little bit like, why? So Daniel does die of the virus eventually, so obviously the immunity isn't through him. And then we don't know if her mother would have been immune to the virus because she wasn't infected, but she died in the coach crash and she died of her injury, so perhaps she was immune. And then also we don't know if the father was immune because we don't know who the father of the baby actually is. Now, I was thinking that a really, really important, interesting part of the story is who is the father of the baby? Who is the father of Eva? Because we don't know. And I had different theories, and I wondered if it was going to be Professor Grant, Hannah's dad, you know, the leading virologist. I thought that was going to be maybe where we were going to go. But as far as I can tell, we don't actually know who the father is. And I thought that was going to be a big reveal, a big plot twist, something really important. And yet, unless I've missed something, I don't think we find out who the baby's father is. And that was a shame. It kind of felt like a missed opportunity. Now, one of the things I really liked about it that I can tell you now because we're in spoiler territory is the whole Daniel is Sean is Carter. I thought that was clever. So in the beginning of the book, you're kind of led to assume that all of these three perspectives are happening simultaneously. They're all happening in the midst of a snowstorm, and you just assume they're all happening at the exact same time. I think that's kind of what you're meant to assume. Turns out later on that actually they're all different timelines, but they have one central character who's pulling you through the plot. So in the first perspective, it's Hannah, and that is the first perspective that's set at the time of when they're kind of leaving the school and trying to get to the retreat. The second perspective, Meg, is actually set 10 years later than that. And the person who was Daniel in Hannah's perspective is now Sean in this perspective. And then in the third perspective, Carter's perspective, that's a few years later than the Meg perspective, whilst they're at the retreat. And the person who was Daniel in the first and then Sean in the second is now Carter himself. I thought that was very clever. I really liked that. I thought that was a really interesting plot device. I was definitely surprised. And when I went back, I was like, oh, that was... yes, I get it. And I thought that was clever. I liked it. But I do think maybe that very clever plot device was kind of at the expense of so many other things. I think the absolute best thing about the book is that 100%. But then so many other things just kind of are a little bit disappointing. So to try and wrap it up, because I've been talking for ages, one of the other things that I didn't like very much is that it kind of felt like there was some fat phobia in here. So one of the characters, Daniel, there's lots of references to him being overweight, and I kind of thought it just made for uncomfortable reading. And I know it's meant to be from one of the characters' perspective, but there are lots of descriptions in here of characters being overweight and then people putting judgment on that, and I didn't like that very much. And the other thing that I didn't like as well was one of the characters is religious, and I felt like there was quite an anti-religious kind of movement in this book, and I found that strange as well. So kind of the fat-phobic references and the kind of anti-religion references, I don't feel like they added anything to the plot. They weren't relevant to the plot. They didn't move anything particularly forward. Didn't really develop any characters, and it just kind of made for uncomfortable reading, to be honest. And then also in terms of uncomfortable reading, there's some serious gore in here, which I think is kind of just done more for the shock value than for like the horror value. So obviously it's partly a horror novel. I was expecting to be a little bit scared, but I don't think I felt scared. I just felt a little bit repulsed, to be honest, at some times. So some of the scenes, there was a scene where, well, one of the women is called Karen with a C, and she is in Carter's perspective. She is at the retreat, so it's on the very final part of the book, and they go out trying to find the people. You know what, I haven't even told you what the virus thing is. I'll get back to that. So the people who get the virus, the majority of people die. The people who don't die are then called whistlers, and that is because their lungs are so infected that when they try to breathe, they kind of whistle at the same time. So they're called whistlers. And they're also going to be contagious for the rest of their life. So it's very difficult to have like whistlers in your common society because they will infect everybody else around them. And then a lot of the people who get infected die. And then the people who don't die, the very small minority who don't die, become whistlers. And also whistlers are meant to be very kind of dangerous, very angry, full of rage. And they're kind of obviously a menace to society. So it's kind of like a zombie idea, but they don't actually kind of eat people's brains, but they definitely pose a direct risk to people. So it's kind of a zombie book, but not 100% properly a zombie. Okay, so getting back to that. You had Carter, they were going out, Karen was with him, they were trying to find whistlers, and the reason for this is you need to keep whistlers, you need their blood to protect against you. That's kind of like a vaccine idea. So they needed blood from them, and they need to be kept alive so you can constantly farm them for their blood. So that's what they're doing, they're trying to find one, doesn't happen, Karen gets attacked, she gets infected, so they take her back, and she's put in one of these isolation rooms. And then she's kind of close to death. She is she's not unconscious, but she's not really there. And then there's a rape scene where one of the other whistlers is just raping her. And I just thought, why? Like, it didn't move the plot forward at all. It was completely unnecessary, and it was just repulsive. I don't really know why it was there. And I feel like there's quite a lot of that. There was a lot of kind of gore. I just didn't like that scene at all. I don't think it was necessary to have one of our characters raped while she was semi-conscious. It just wasn't necessary. And then the other things that, yeah, there was a lot of weird kind of gore things. The kind of, when the girl was pregnant and they just kind of said she was a husk of a shell, and it wasn't very nice. Some of it wasn't very nice, but again, not scary. Didn't find it scary or eerie or creepy or clever in kind of that way. Just kind of like, oh, that was repulsive and I don't really know why it was there. So that was a big shame for me. Let me think, what other things didn't I like? So I'm just going to spoil the ending because we're at the spoilers bit. So what I didn't like about it was, like I said, this is meant to be a survival story, but everybody dies. So at the very end, we find out that the person who was Daniel, who became Sean, who became Carter, is set on revenge. His whole character arc is revenge. He wants to kill the man who caused his sister's death, who believes is Professor Grant, the leading virologist. Now, not absolutely caused the death, because he didn't crash the coach. He did himself crash the coach. But, you know, he's the cause, he thinks, of his sister's death. So the whole story for him is revenge. So we get to the end. The idea is Professor Grant is meant to be held captive at the retreat. He isn't meant to be infected. He's meant to be okay, but he's held captive purely because he is an asset and presumably valuable to people who might want to pay for him to get him released. So he's there, but then he isn't actually there. It's empty, and he never was there. Now, I'm not sure if Professor Grant is okay somewhere else and he's alive, or if he might be a whistler. So in the very final scenes with Daniel / Sean / Carter, we think we see Professor Grant as a whistler, but I am wondering, like, do we actually see him as a whistler, or is it because Carter is so unwell with the virus and he's maybe having hallucinations and delusions and he's being ravaged by this infection? Like, is it even real? I don't know. So either he's okay somewhere else and we've no idea, or he is actually a whistler. He doesn't kill him anyway, so he never actually gets his revenge. And at the very end, when he's very, very poorly, he could have gone and joined the other whistlers who were living in the woods that we know about, but he kills himself. He just throws himself off, and that's that. And just immediately before that, the reason that he is infected is because presumably they're kind of viral things where kind of vaccine things should have been working. But they find out, this again is also a bit convoluted. Okay, so they find out that the man who was meant to be putting the infected bodies in the incinerator has not been doing so because the incinerator does not work. So he's been putting the bodies just behind the incinerator, just out in the open air, which is absurd because we know that people can get infected from infected bodies, so that's why you have to incinerate the bodies. You can't just bury them or leave them out because obviously animals can eat them, and then those animals will be infected, and if someone then kills the animal as a hunter and then eats the meat, then they in themselves will get infected and die, etc, etc. So you're not meant to do that. There's all these levels of infection that is very important in this book. So anyway, he just does that. It turns out that there's a dog in this book anyway called Dexter. He manages to get through a little hole in the fence, and he goes out and he's been like routinely eating these corpses for presumably a really long time. So he himself is infected, and then our main character in that final perspective, Carter, loves this dog, and he always lets the dog lick him all over his face. Then we find out, oh, he was infected because of the dog, and then he shoots the dog, and then he kills himself. And I just thought, it was such a disappointment. It's meant to be a survival story, and essentially everyone dies apart from Eva, and she wasn't even like a central character. She was just the baby. Not just the baby, but you know, she was the baby, and then later on, when we saw her like as a newborn when she was like a day old to maybe like 1 or 2 days old. We never saw her again until she was like 16 years old. So yeah, I'm not going to talk anymore about why I found it disappointing, because I think I could talk about this absolutely ages, and I've been talking for ages. So right, I'm going to wrap it up there. I found it a bit disappointing. It just was nowhere near as good as her other 2 books. I will definitely read from her again. I'll definitely pick up some of her other books. Interested in reading some of her backlists. I've had those on kind of my radar for a while, and I'll definitely pick up whichever book she publishes next. But this just wasn't for me. Just wasn't my cup of tea. It was disappointing. Nowhere near as good as The Chalk Man or The Burning Girls. They're very different kind of tones of books. I think if you haven't read anything by her, I would definitely recommend you read The Chalk Man or The Burning Girls, and I will leave my reviews down below so you can hear my thoughts on them. But this one just didn't do it for me, and yeah, it was definitely fast-paced. And I was intrigued, and that clever plot device where 3 of the characters were actually the same character and it was all different timelines. Very clever, 100%. Got to give you your due for that. That was clever and I liked it. But apart from that, I've definitely read better post-apocalyptic novels, definitely read better thriller horrors. So yeah, disappointing, 2 stars. I'm still glad I read it though, because it was one of my most highly anticipated books of the year. Just wasn't for me, and that was a shame. So yeah, if you have read this book, I would love to know your thoughts on it down in the comments below. Yeah, I want to know what you thought of it. If you liked it or you didn't like it, I'd just love to know what you thought of it. All right then, I'll see you in my next one.